Today, a really solid question from one of you concerning my last video, which orbited that Keystone Cops recall of the Volvo EX30 electric car. Like, dude, just don't charge it beyond 70% and it won't burn the house down with you and the fam asleep in it, kind of thing. We hope. Okay, so if EV batteries are seemingly in the news all the time, burning down a bunch of cargo ships or just lighting fire spontaneously in various cities around the world, underground car parks on the freeway, whatever, then what gives? Because we've all got power tools and none of us are seemingly concerned about them self-immolating because they don't do that very frequently, do they? And yet they use the same fundamental technology. And you never see Milwaukee or Makita or DeWalt or some organisation like that issuing an urgent recall that demands that you just don't charge your power tool batteries beyond 70%, do you? And yet, here we are in a world like that right now. This question opens the window to a fascinating area of engineering that more people should be aware of. It's about complexity and failure modes and things of that nature. So if you're busily evangelizing that EVs are so simple, so much simpler than combustion, and there's a transition afoot, and this is the way forward, it's inevitable, just a matter of time, I got some bad news for you. You might want to sit this one out. You're a tool bloke, John. Why don't our tool batteries do the same as EV car batteries? Don't get me wrong, FFS. I've got a shite load, presumably a metric one, of live power tools. Just want to understand why our live tool batteries don't do the same as car EV batteries, i.e. spontaneously combust. For reference, I still, don't know why, sentiment maybe, or I just can't throw out useful tools, have a Metabo SBZ18 impulse drill charger and a couple of 18-volt 2.2 amp hour batteries made in or around 2012 that still work fine. Genuinely curious because we don't, as far as I know, hear about tool batteries behaving like car EV batteries. Mars Noib 2732 there, and I bet he can fight with a name like that. Like, mum and dad probably came here by boat and he got ragged about it endlessly at school, so his fists got hard and his wits got keen. Channeling my inner man in black there momentarily. Anyway, good freaking question, Mars Noib. Let us prime our grey matter upstairs for an intellectual assault. This episode is actually, I'll make it as light as I possibly can, but it's going to be a real bleed from the ears number. So the only thing I can suggest to ameliorate that in some way is to warm up with a good old-fashioned dose of the NordVPN hotties. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. Get a mega discount plus 4 extra months for free right now with my exclusive deal. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Online security threats are everywhere, but you don't have to be the next victim. That's where NordVPN comes in, locking everything down securely in the background. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Every 2-year plan receives that huge discount plus 4 extra months of Nord for free. nordvpn.com/AEJC. Using NordVPN is easy. Just subscribe, download the app and connect. One click later, your IP address is shielded and your traffic is encrypted across as many as 6 of your devices. Nord is the fastest VPN on the planet. It costs only about as much as a single cup of coffee every month to keep your data, your identity, and your devices secure. Masking your location means you'll be able to access content and resources that might be blocked where you live. Plus, you can continue to watch your favourite content when you travel. Boost your online security at nordvpn.com/AEJC. Get that mega discount and enjoy those 4 extra months for free. It's all totally risk-free with Nord's rock-solid 30-day money-back guarantee. It's easy to stay safe online. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. It is about to be bleed from the ears o'clock, so if you do have a little quick clot gauze in the pharmacy cupboard upstairs or something, I might whip upstairs and just reach for that now. I'll try and make it as digestible and light as possible, but this is inherently a complex thing to unpack. And for this reason, I am going to refer to my notes a little more often than usual, if you don't mind, and that's merely because there's so many things to keep upstairs here that I fear if I don't, I'm just going to gloss over part of it because I know that, but I might fail to deliver it to you, and that will make the explanation seem somehow a little less complete. So forgive me for that in advance. Now, the place to start here, if you want to flip this switch and think more like an engineer about complex things, is let's do a little unpacking of basic technology. And the simplest way to do that, I think, is if we start with my trusty Olight Warrior Mini 2. This is not a promo for them, by the way. It's just something I carry all the time. And there is a direct line of sight between this baby and your power tools and a Tesla, for example, because they all have these batteries inside them. This obviously is a proprietary one. It's got Olight written all over it, but just under that you will see the numbers 18650 because this is a particularly standardized kind of cell that we see in power tool battery packs all the time. Well, we don't see them, but they're just there under the plastic, hidden in plain sight kind of thing. You get these 12-volt battery packs and they all look like this, and they're all this shape and approximate size because they've got 3 of these in them. Now, the voltage of a lithium-ion cell such as this is 3.6 volts. If you put 3 of them together and charge them fully, you get about 12 volts, sort of open circuit 12 volts out of it. And hence, this is a 12-volt battery pack because 3 of these are in here, just like that, in series. There's your 12-volt battery pack. Now, when you look at a battery pack like this, which goes in your more heavy-duty drill or driver kit or any one of the other 14,000 different power tools that they designed for this particular battery system, and all the analogous ones out there, the yellow one, the blue one, whatever other colours there are. You've got your rigids and your AEGs and your more prosumer ones, Ozito and Ryobi and all of that crap. When you look at this, there is the space for 2 tiers of 5 of these batteries stacked, like 2 decks of them, 5 here and 5 above. You put 5 3.6 volt cells together, you get 18 volts, which is why this one is called an M18 battery pack. And then you stack 2 of them together in parallel, 2 of those sub-modules of 5 together. The voltage doesn't change, but the amount of current it can deliver does change. It doubles, and that gives you more power because volts times amps equals power. That's how this works. Now, you might notice if you're at the Power Tool Emporium that you get 4 amp hours and 5 amp hours and 6 amp hours, and that is purely down to the choice of internal chemistry that the manufacturer makes. They can tweak the chemistry for greater energy storage, and that makes your 4 amp hour battery into a 5 amp hour battery into a 6 amp hour battery. It's more expensive to do that, hence the jump in price, right? So this is how your basic power tool battery pack system works. There's probably a printed circuit board inside here. Don't pull them apart. Very dangerous, unless you know what you're doing, so don't do that. But inside here, there's probably a printed circuit board designed to talk to the charger, I guess. And as for cooling, these things cool passively because they have a relatively high surface area to volume ratio, and that means there's a lot of surface area per battery to devote to passive cooling to the environment. Another couple of things to consider is that although these devices do discharge brutally, like they can deliver a shit ton of work quickly, the duty cycle is quite short per iteration of their use. Like even if you're driving in dirty big 4-inch long, 100 mil long bugle head screws that are like really thick gauge jobbies, you drive one in, that's a big belt on every one of these batteries in the pack. Okay, so there's that. But then you stop and you got to root around and find another screw and probably transition from your driver to your drill and drill another hole so you can put the next screw in. So there's actually a lot of downtime during which the pack is convecting passively into the environment. So this is kind of the operational environment for these batteries, and it can be quite harsh. They can be in the sun, they get dropped all the time, they're used in wet conditions, blah, blah, blah. It's not a cakewalk. It's not a cakewalk like it is for some other battery devices that never get subjected to this harsh environmental use, but it's very different to the way they're used in an EV. Now, I just want to check that I haven't glossed over anything here. Another key thing, which is why the notes are so important, is that the BMS, like the battery management system here, is extremely basic. Individual cells, for example, are not monitored, right? So this is extremely different to an EV. We'll get to that. There's a very slow rate of charge as well with these things. So when you put them on the charger, it's going to take like an hour or two to charge up, depending on the system. The charger in the box is generally not that fast because the manufacturer wants you to go and buy a fast charger. So you're looking at, 60 to 100 watts. And if 10% of that energy is wasted because the charging process is not 100% efficient, then you're only looking at bleeding 6 to 10 watts out of the whole setup into the environment, which is not a big job for this passive convection envelope that the battery comes wrapped in, right? So from a charging point of view, dead easy. This is a cakewalk for the battery and the heat management system there. Now, when you look at an EV, if we think about this for a moment, 5 amp hours, you know how volts times amps equals power? Well, volts times amp hours equals watt hours, and 5 times 18 equals 90. And that means 90 watt hours compared with, 75 or something kilowatt hours. So 90 amp hours versus 77,000 watt hours in an EV battery. We're talking a device, the battery in an EV is a device that is 800 times this on fundamentals in ballpark terms, right? 800 times. So it's rare that you would make something 800 times bigger in engineering terms without there being substantial operational differences added to the nature of whatever you're making. And the number of differences multiplies with the complexity, and this is such a big issue. We'll get to that in just a second. The other thing is the nature of failure modes with a battery like this. If a battery like this fails, the usual consequence is you jam it into your drill and the drill doesn't work, right? So the battery's dead, but it usually doesn't do the whole Chernobyl meet Vesuvius thing, right? It just doesn't. The most likely way to make one of these batteries do the Vesuvius thing is to put it in the garbage, which you should never do, because the compactor can cause a catastrophic short circuit, and that will lead potentially to an explosion. The other thing a tradie might do is drop it off the roof onto the concrete and then just mark it as the damaged one and put it on the dashboard of the ute and then lock it in the sun and have a few beers over lunch or something and then come back and see the fireys mopping up. So damage, I think mechanical damage would be the main mechanism leading to catastrophic failure of a battery such as this. And There's a lot of attention on car batteries too, a lot of media attention, right? So if a tradie's ute burns to the ground because of a battery, it would have to be a fairly slow news day for that to be the lead story, I'd suggest. Like if Albo is attacking the freedom of speech and behaving ever more like Chairman frickin' Mao, that's going to get a run ahead of some, muzzle spanner's ute burning to the ground, isn't it? So power tool batteries, the thing to take away from this is the first fundamental difference is that power tool batteries are remarkably less complex. Just to summarise all of that, a typical 18-volt power tool battery pack has about 10 cells in it. It cools itself passively. It's got a very simple battery management system and sometimes no monitoring at the level of individual cells, very few sensors and other supplementary systems, and quite short operational duty cycles. Whereas a typical EV battery pack has hundreds to thousands of cells, like thousands of 18650s or something, maybe about 500 or 600 if they're pouch or prismatic cells. It's liquid cooled in an EV because the waste heat is a dead set problem. We'll get to that. It's got dozens upon dozens of different sensors monitoring different kinds of operational behaviour. It's got active software control. It's subject to long duty cycles, like hours upon hours of cruising at sustained speeds, etc. And there are tight temperature uniformity requirements throughout the battery pack. I'd suggest, therefore, that this is a completely different thing in two important ways. One, the operational environment is completely different, and two, the scale and complexity is completely different. It's fair to say that an EV battery is like 800 times bigger or something, but the complexity does not scale in a linear fashion. It's not 800 times more complex because it's got 800 times more of this or that in it. It's actually thousands, maybe tens of thousands of times more complex because this is like going up the family tree. There's branches and branches and branches and you double every time, and before you know it, there's tens of thousands of ancestors for you to trace or something, right? Complexity scales in a totally non-linear way. And this is the fight that engineers engage in every day in R&D when they design these massive battery packs that also have to be as compact as possible and, let's face it, as affordable as possible. If you take nothing else away from this video, let it be this. Complexity is absolutely the enemy of reliability, and this is a major struggle in R&D. Complex systems require the highest levels of quality assurance during manufacture to head off any potential defects. This is the primary countermeasure against catastrophic failures, right? EV batteries are inherently extremely complex, so you have to lose this myth that goes around the internet all the time, which is abject bullshit, stating that EVs are simpler than combustion vehicles. They don't have as many moving parts. They don't have as many mechanical components. That is entirely true, and in that respect, they are simpler. But their complexity is different, and in one important respect, it's more insidious because it's less apparent. It's the geometric progression of complexity and the impact of that on reliability if every check and balance in R&D and manufacturing is not perfectly in play. And this is the game of Russian roulette that we are playing currently out there on the road, because the consequences of failure are so profound. Lives are at risk. There's a carcinogenic and otherwise toxic shitstorm in play every time a significant lithium-ion battery pack enters thermal runaway in the public domain. So to summarise the top line differences here, an average power tool battery costs a couple of $100. It's user swappable. It lives outside the cabin of wherever you're operating generally. You're not that close to it, in other words, or you can get away from it easily. Failure usually just means that the tool doesn't work, and the fire risk is somewhat localised as well as rare. Whereas with the EV battery, the cost is in the tens of thousands of dollars. It's structurally integrated to the car. It's just under your ass. It's like 12 inches away from your tush every time. And the failure can mean you lose the vehicle, your house burns down, and lives are at risk. And this obviously attracts regulators, insurers, lawyers, and a lot of media scrutiny. And that means, and a lot of people are going to be pretty surprised to hear me say this, but it's an engineering fact. The batteries in EVs are engineered and built to an extraordinarily high standard, much higher than a power tool battery. And it's because complexity is the enemy of reliability, and the quality assurance countermeasures must be in place, and they must be executed at an extremely high level, like SEAL Team 6 levels of quality assurance, etc. And I can't overstate the Herculean task that it is to engineer a battery that sits in a car in that harsh, vibrating, hot, cold, wet, dry, whatever operating environment, subject to all kinds of mechanical shocks and expected to last for 15 years. Like, this is a big deal. It's extremely hard to get this right. The checks and balances in place are really good generally, but because of the number of potential failure pathways, inevitably the deployment of these things is going to be imperfect and disasters are going to happen. And this is one of the problems I've got with this evangelizing EVs, because if you want to evangelize net zero EVs, the transition, which is not a transition, it's maybe 20% of sales are going to be EVs foreseeably into the future kind of thing. But if we're going to manage that and deploy these things into society generally, we have to acknowledge the impact of the complexity and the tight coupling of the various systems in the battery and the staggering amount of energy in there, the consequences if something goes wrong, and we have to have operational countermeasures in place so that the public is experiencing the least amount of risk. And what we're doing at the moment is we're deploying these pieces of shit and hoping for the best. That's not how you do it. So the executive summary there is that power tool batteries are designed for these short, energetic, some would say brutal bursts of discharge. They are expected to run hot and be used in the 40-degree summer and be fairly reliable. It's okay if they degrade a little bit faster than the battery in an EV because of the replacement cost, and they're expected to be replaced, which is why if you just duck down to Bunnings or some other tool retailer, there'll be stacks and stacks of replacement batteries on the shelf. EV batteries are a completely different animal. They're expected to last 10 to 15 years, in line with the average life of a conventional combustion car. They're expected to tolerate daily charging, sometimes at rates of up to or exceeding 150 kilowatts. They're expected to work in all climates, from the Arctic to the desert, and they're expected to fail gracefully, not sort of Mount Vesuvius, let's get on the news drama. Not only that, and I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but the EV battery is a classic case of a tightly coupled system with a lot of embodied energy. And a lot of people outside the domain of engineering and science are a bit hazy on what tightly coupled means. It means nothing is allowed to fail in isolation, or nothing really can fail in isolation. It means a failure here can generate a cascade of subsequent failures, and when that happens, it's kind of impossible to get out of the way. And this is why when you drive an EV, it can be just another day at the office, and 10 seconds later it can be Chernobyl. And that very rarely happens with a combustion car, because the systems, believe it or not, whether or not you want to be some capital E, capital V evangelist, that's up to you. But an engineering fact is that the systems in a car that matter in this way are far less tightly coupled, and that means you get more warning in general before something goes catastrophically wrong. I can forgive anybody who spent most of science class at school just thinking about boobies instead of actual science, because they do try to make it very unentertaining, I'd have to say. It's a real struggle to pay attention to mathematics and science. That's why STEM is so inaccessible for most people, because boobies are just there continuously. They don't even have to be there in reality. You can just... imagination. It's a marvellous thing. Anywho, you've been dealing with batteries your whole life. I get that. Not maybe these ones, but AA's and AAA's and D-size batteries and those massive bricks. You know, those 6-volt bricks you used to put in the Dolphin torch if you're as frickin' old as me. Anyway, you've been handling batteries your whole life and they seem unremarkable and inert, etc., don't they? Like, battery, dude. But I can come up pretty quickly with 6 things that can go wrong with a battery such as this, because it's much more complex than you think. It's got a box, like it's got an outer case, and inside every battery has a thing called a cathode and a thing called an anode, because they need to have a positive bit and a negative bit. And to make science inaccessible, they don't call them positive bit and negative bit, they call them cathode and anode, entertainingly. This means that there needs to be a separator between the cathode and the anode, because if there's not, the battery is not going to work. It's just going to spontaneously discharge. There's also a positive tab and a negative tab. So that's 6 things. It's the box, it's the cathode, the anode, the separator, the positive tab and the negative tab. So something goes catastrophically wrong with any of those things, the battery fails. That's 6 failure modes per battery, right? Times 10. So there's 60 different ways fundamentally that just the cells can fail in a pack, right? And then if you multiply by 800, because Teslas have 5,000 to 7,000 of these, if memory serves, it's a number like that, and they are the most popular EVs on the planet, and Elon did make them by welding a whole bunch of these together and sticking them in an epoxy resin box in the structural packs anyway. So you can see that even if we do a linear scaling of the ways that they can fail, there's a shit ton of ways that different batteries can fail. And when each one of these is encased in a solid sort of obelisk of epoxy, it's kind of hard to drill down into the $1 problem, isn't it? That's why you got to scrap the whole battery pack often. In a power tool, 60 things. In a in an EV, sorry, just went out to lunch there thinking about boobies. In an EV, there's like 5,000 to 7,000 things that can fail, or even in an EV like a Hyundai Kia EV or a BYD thing that uses either a prismatic or a pouch cell. There's 500 of them, so there's 500 times those 6 things that I mentioned. So that's 3,000 things that can go wrong, and that's before we even step outside the cell FFS. Okay, each one of those things, this is like a domain of failure. You can have a range of failures that might affect the separator between the cathode and the anode, or that might affect the positive terminal or the negative terminal or the case or the anode or the cathode itself. And I made a list of them, right? Because then we're talking about individual failure mechanisms, and I can't remember these things because there's so frickin' many of them, but they include things like lithium plating or dendrite growth inside the guts of the battery. There's SEI breakdown or gas generation inside the battery. It's really a problem when the electrolyte in the battery starts to decompose thermally because it generates its own oxygen gas, and all of a sudden, Chernobyl, dude, you're on the news. You can have an internal short circuit, which can ramp the temperature and lead to some of those other things like gas generation. the electrolyte might just dry out, which is a bit of a bastard, and then your battery just stops working. Mechanical fatigue can take place in any of this because vibration, shocks, etc. Thermal runaway initiation, that's a bad one, often caused by cascades of other upstream problems. Manufacturing contamination, because there's no manufacturing process on Earth that can ensure that small contaminants don't get into big fat vats of chemicals, because, you know, human frailty and process control and things of that nature. So in formal engineering terms, they've got this thing called FMEA, which stands for Failure Modes and Effects Analysis, like what causes it, what's the pathway, and how bad can it possibly be. In the case of EV batteries, pretty bad. So each one of these failure domains typically explodes geometrically into the branches on a tree, just branching out and out and out into these distinct failure modes. And there's also this phenomenon of interconnection, right? And there's module level failures as well, because inside an EV, the individual battery cells are glommed up into modules, and the modules are assembled into the battery pack itself, and then you can have these module level failures. So per cell, there's a weld on this end and a weld on that end to connect the cell to the rest of its friends in various different ways, and those welds can fail. So instead of 6, there's 8 different failure at the cell level kind of things. And those welds, right, if you want to think about the cascading upward into the tree, these welds on the end, and in the case of a Tesla, there might be 14,000 welds, right, because 7,000 cells. So 14,000 welds, and each one of those is subjected to vibration, so it can fail by fatigue. It's cycled thermally because batteries freeze when you park the car overnight. They get really cold in Canada or something. They get really hot by virtue of their operation, or just by virtue of being parked in a 45°C day in summer out in the sun, whatever. Dissimilar metals, right? Doesn't matter how similar you try and get the metals, you're talking about a dissimilar metal getting on another dissimilar bit of metal and then spot welded together. So you've got the potential for galvanic effects like corrosion, which can weaken the material. It's also generally stainless steel, so it work hardens. That's a fatigue and corrosion problem as well. And let's not forget that there's a shit ton of electricity going in and out on a regular basis. So each one of those welds is one point of failure, but I can count at least 4 different distinct failure modes for the welds. And you can see how complexity just ramps geometrically, and one cell failing because it's close to another one cascades into a different mode of thermal overload or something for another one. And then there are all these vital peripheral systems in an EV battery that do not exist in a battery pack like this for your drill, right? And these would include things like the cooling system, and I made a list here as well because I can't keep all that in my head, but the cooling system is susceptible to 6 different failure modes that I could come up with off the top of my head, right? The coolant could just leak out. That's bad. There's blockages, potentially. We're talking about a cooling system that's going to be in place for more than a decade, so different things, sediments and corrosion, whatever, can fall out, block different bits. The pump might fail because the fluid doesn't just get itself around the cooling system. If there is a blockage, there can be an imbalance of flow, and part of the battery could be much hotter than another part of the battery, and then whether or not that's a problem depends on where the temperature probes are, right? You can just have a loss of thermal contact because you've got cells in a module, and then the module has a cooling system around it, and there needs to be contact between the outside of the cooling system and the outside of the module so that you can get conduction of heat through there, so that the heat that you need to reject out of the cells can travel into the fluid that's going to transfer it to the heat exchanger by convection, okay? This is why I don't want to be an engineer anymore, because it just makes your brain hurt. But anyway, if you lose that thermal contact between the outside of the pack and the outside of the cooling system, if they separate, you don't get the conduction that you need to achieve the convection with the working fluid. And that's a flat-out potential disaster. And we're talking about a box that sits in a vibrating, hot, cold, shaken all over environment for 10 years or more. Okay, and inevitably things like this are going to happen. I'd further suggest that one failure in the cooling system, and this is why there's this non-linearity of complexity and risk sort of expansion, orders of magnitude, thousands of times, not just in direct proportion to how many more cells. It's because if the cooling system fails, like one failure in a cooling system can cascade off and affect dozens of cells catastrophically and engage a completely different part of the potential failure chain, right? There's also the BMS, like the battery management system, and related condition sensing systems that can fail in a bunch of interesting ways in your EV battery, such as, and I can't keep this in my head either, dude, but 6 things. The sensing of the voltage can just drift in some way, like the sensor that's on the battery or on individual cells or modules to determine the voltage can just go out of whack because it's getting old. Second law of thermodynamics, right? It's everywhere. Temperature sensors can go on the fritz as well, or they might just be put in the wrong place, or there might be some operational effect that they didn't figure out in R&D that means the temperature sensor, which worked well in R&D, is operationally in a bad spot because of something that happens in 5 years' time. Like, we can't know that. There's calibration errors and there might be firmware logic type errors because Toshi in R&D is doing his best and his team is doing their best with the logic for the control. But this is a complex system and it can fail in ways that they can't predict. And in that case, the logic will be inappropriate or not tuned, if you like, for every potential failure mode, and then the control system could potentially not intervene at the right time. State of charge estimation errors can take place because as things age, they go on the fritz, and there might even be a fault with communications on a CAN bus level that happen as the car ages. None of this stuff is foreseeable necessarily. 100% of it at least is foreseeable in R&D because of the underlying complexity. The protection systems can fail as well. There's numerous protection systems in a car battery that don't exist in a battery such as this. Contactors can fuse, open or closed. Like, you've got contactors designed to open or close at various different times. And if they're not used that frequently, then over time they just go on the fritz because they get corroded and they won't move anymore. When the solenoid tries to activate them, they just are reluctant to move, right? Fuses could blow as a nuisance kind of item. They got to make the fuses robust enough so that that doesn't happen. But then they could also fail to open circuit. In other words, like when they're designed to blow, they don't blow for whatever reason because of additional resistance further upstream or Christ knows what. The pre-charge system, which kind of conditions the battery to accept a charge, it might fail in some undefined way. And the high voltage isolators might degrade over time as well, because one of the main protection systems, for example, is that in a crash, you would have a high voltage battery isolator switch. So when the airbags deploy, the high voltage isolator switch goes, and it's designed to disconnect the high voltage battery, like the traction battery, from the outside world. Can you guarantee with 100% certainty that that is going to happen in 10 years' time in a Tesla that's been driven up and down 10 k's each way every day on a corrugated dirt road? Probably not. Might not have any effect, but it might not work when you need it to, and then that could lead to some sort of catastrophic fire, heaven forbid, with somebody trapped inside the vehicle, because the integrity of all of these systems cannot be guaranteed with 100% certainty. Very different to one of these, I'd suggest. Even though they're both lithium-ion and they use notionally at a very simplistic, superficial level the same technology. You can see, though, that the implementation of that technology is radically different. I mean, I can anyway. So we're going to see a lot more of some of these failures, contactors failing and fuses failing to blow or nuisance blow or isolation switches failing to activate and things of that nature, cooling system problems as the age of EVs, like the median age of EVs in the fleet, increases. What we've been fortunate enough to see lately is probably the best window into EV reliability and safety that we are ever going to see, because the age of EVs on average is so low now. They're pretty new devices. As they get old, inevitably, their reliability is going to get worse, and that's going to impact on the safety of the battery. That's not my opinion. It's a freaking mathematical certainty, because the second law of thermodynamics pertains to everything in the universe. Nothing, not even EVs, net zero, gets a free frickin' pass, dude, because it just doesn't work that way. And you can be an evangelist if you want, and you can be a net zero zealot if you want. There's no law against that. It's perfectly allowed, but you can't argue the toss about the reality of the implementation of these systems. And like, if I was an electric car owner, I'd be concerned about that. Like if I was an an EX30 owner subjected to this recent recall, I wouldn't be as offended by my sort of frank take on this as I would be about the absolute operational truth of these things, right? Because that would concern me, because they're facts. And it's really good to be a fact, because you don't have to give a shit what people think of you. You're still a fact kind of thing. Many of these systems, incidentally, these control systems like the high voltage isolation switch and other systems of this nature, are very rarely activated in an EV. Like once per serious crash, once per write-off in the case of that isolation switch. But in plenty of other protective mechanisms, these systems are rarely activated. And the problem with systems that don't get activated very often is that they just gum up. They're problematic. So this is a complete bastard, and EVs don't get a free kick there either. If you use something every day, like you turn a tap on every day, you undo a set of bolts every day or every week, whatever, they're unlikely to rust up. The things that gum up, the things that jam in a particular position, are things that don't get activated often. They're the problems, right? That's why it's hard to pull apart a machine that hasn't been apart for 20 years, kind of thing. Very easy to pull apart a machine that has to have something loaded up into it once a week. Yeah? So there's that. They're also safety critical systems, and they're very time dependent when it comes to their reliability over the long term. So second law of thermodynamics does not give these things a free pass, basically. Even the structural enclosure of the battery, not this battery so much, but it is vulnerable, I guess, but because of the nature of the battery, you can see damage and you can replace it easily. Just pull it off the tool and dispose of it responsibly, as they say in the ads. But the box that holds the battery in an electric car is subject to mechanical deformation, like driving up the freeway, truck drops something off the back, or a tradie drops something off the back, an anvil, problematically. You go over the top of it and you leave a dirty big 6-foot scar on the floor of the battery box. That's bad, and it might have unknowable consequences for the guts inside, right? Crash loads. If you're in a minor crash, even the load that the inertial load that the crash imposes on the mounting points of the battery could impose shock loads internally or elsewhere that have real long-term effects on the battery. There's no test for that. You don't plug into the OBD2 port and see if that's okay. That's ridiculous. There's no sensors for any of that. There's no fault code for any of that. The seals could degrade, and the welds or the material itself could be subject to corrosion. So not even the box is guaranteed to have 100% integrity, and Obviously, if any of that happens, it can lead to another branch of the tree activating itself, and all of a sudden you're in Pripyat back in 1986 kind of thing. And these failure modes, right, they're not independent. They're like little catalysts. They're like having a room full of mouse traps and you throw a ping pong ball in, and then all of the mouse traps activate as, cascades happen this way or that way. It's unknowable, dude. Which leads us to the great lie that capital E, capital V evangelists tell themselves and others at every opportunity. They say EVs are so much simpler than combustion, than ice kind of thing. It rolls off the tongue, and if you're uneducated, yeah, I get how you can see that because of the mechanical complexity of things like engines and the number of moving parts and things of that nature. But EVs are actually more complex, differently complex, but more complex in ways that really matter. This is a scientific fact. You can't argue the toss about that. They just are. The complexity is more insidious because of the doors to really catastrophic and serious failure modes, like life and death failure modes that open when some of these failures happen. And it's complexity fighting reliability over there in the fringes, despite the best efforts of a whole bunch of really diligent PhDs in R&D. I don't want to understate that, because these people go into R&D centres every day. They're very serious about what they do, and they absolutely try their best to keep society safe. It's just inherent to the nature of systems that are so tightly coupled with so much energy, and these toxic compounds like cobalt and hydrofluoric acid and all of that stuff. When something goes wrong, it's a flat-out catastrophe, and lives are absolutely at risk. So to lay this out, combustion powertrains have thousands of parts. There's probably 6,000 parts when you think about it in an engine and transmission. Like a modern engine and transmission probably has about 6,000 components, and it depends obviously how you define component, but let's say 6,000. You're not going to pull one apart and count, neither am I. That's a good estimate. Many of those components, though, are pretty forgiving mechanically, right? Like you get lots of warning for many mechanical failures. You don't get much warning when a battery goes Chernobyl, okay? So that means that many of these failures are kind of progressive, like they progress from mild to severe, and you can intervene in the middle. This is typical of, let's say your car starts making a funny noise and you note it. And then you drive along for a bit and the noise gets louder. And eventually you get to a point where a responsible person would discontinue just turning the music up and say, you know what, I've really got to go to a mechanic. And then they're going to go down this rabbit hole of, yes, well, that noise sounds like it's coming from here and it's proportional to the road speed or the engine revs, or it happens when you accelerate or when you don't, or whatever. There's a diagnosis pathway because the system in this respect is less tightly coupled, right? That's a salient difference, right? Catastrophic failure of combustion engines and transmissions tends to be fairly rare, and it also tends to be highly localized. It doesn't tend to consume the whole vehicle and vehicles around it or the building it's parked in kind of thing. That's very rare. Whereas EV battery packs have very few mechanical parts, hardly anything moves, although the working fluid does move and the pump, etc., for the cooling system. They're far more tightly coupled though, and they have all of these safety critical elements that spiral out of control rapidly. That is a fact. And they're far less tolerant of hidden defects. They're far less tolerant. We could get 100 engineers in a panel and get them to vote on all of these points, and they go, yeah. Even engineers that work exclusively on electric cars and love electric cars because that's their passion, blah, blah, blah. You have to acknowledge the truth of these systems if you want to deploy them into society and have them safe. That's just how this works. And what this means, I guess the summary of all of this is that if your engine gets smoky over time, that's a red flag and you have to do something about it. Whereas your EV is far more likely to function just fine, like clockwork until the one day when it doesn't. And I hope to fuck that when that happens, if that happens to you, that you are not in the right-hand lane. We drive on the left if you're in America or Europe. Anyway, if you're in the right-hand lane of the freeway with all these cars going past you at 110 k's an hour with 3 kids in the car and your EV is going Chernobyl, which is unlikely but no less a bastard when you're in it, if that happens to you, I hope you're not in that situation, right? I hope you can get out to safety, go upwind, all of those things. Like there's not even a public fucking education campaign in Australia or anywhere else that I know of about if there's a vehicle fire, like any vehicle fire, combustion vehicle fire, don't breathe the smoke. Electric vehicle fire, really don't breathe the smoke. So, you know, if that happens around you, don't film it for Instagram, you know. Look at where the wind is blowing. And if it's blowing the smoke towards you, run sideways and then run upwind and get away from the smoke, because you don't even have to breathe it. You just have to get it on your skin and the cobalt can go straight through and give you heavy metal poisoning, which nobody wants. The final big issue, the big difference between this battery and this battery pack and the 800 times bigger battery pack in your EV is the management of waste heat and the magnitude of that assignment. Like when I put my torch on the charger, I just put it there and walk away, and it's a very small amount of chemicals and it charges at a very low rate because it's USB-A, so probably 10 watts or something, maybe 15, I don't know. But something of that nature, like it's a trivial amount. And that means that the waste heat would be maybe 1-2 watts, something like that. Like even in a warm room, 1 to 2 watts of waste heat is nothing. It convects away. It's got an aluminium body with all these surface features on it that would be really good at dissipating heat. Now, when you connect this battery to its charger, and it takes like 2 hours to charge up or something, it's probably charging at about 50 watts, 60 watts, maybe 100, depends on the charger you've got. They all sell fast chargers. The one in the box tends to be a bit slower, but even so, if it's 100 watts and the waste heat is 10 watts because no process is 100% efficient, then this box is going to convect the shit out of 10 watts all day long, even if the room is hot, whatever. You know, if the wind is blowing, it's a no-brainer, like all day long, dude, forced convection. So the management of waste heat in a battery pack such as this is a trivial job for the engineers who designed the battery. And there would be, at best, a rudimentary temperature sensor in here somewhere designed just to deactivate or discontinue the charging or not allow it to begin when you plug the battery in if it's already warm, kind of thing. So trivial. Whereas, let's say you connect your EV, you want to charge fast because you're halfway from Sydney to Melbourne and you don't want it to be a 15-hour proposition. You want to be as fast as possible. They've put a 150 kilowatt charger in the exact location that you need, and you drive up to it and there's no queue. It's the lay down misère Goldilocks perfect EV en route charging scenario. You go, girl, saving the planet kind of thing. You plug in 150 kilowatts into the battery. Yay. This means that you will get a full charge, or, 80% of a full charge in half an hour kind of thing. It's going to ramp back a little bit when the battery gets full. But anyway, you get a shit ton of electricity in a comparatively small space of time. Yay. Let's talk about the practical implications of doing that, though. 150 kilowatts is a lot of power. It's, in many cases, beyond the peak power generated by many mainstream modern internal combustion engines in mainstream cars. okay? And you are tipping that amount of electricity in there, and it doesn't seem very dramatic because no moving parts, no exhaust noise, none of that drama, but all of the physics, all of the power. Because charging is not 100% efficient, you would have to assume that there is between 5 and 10% waste heat generated. So that means at 150 kilowatts, that's between 7.5 kilowatts and 15 kilowatts of waste heat in the battery pack. And you go, uneducated people who didn't study physics and really understand that stuff go, yeah, so what, 7.5 kilowatts. Let's go to Bingley or the Good Guys or something and buy a room heater, and let's make it the biggest, most fuck-off room heater available to stick in a standard GPO power point in Australia. That's going to be about 2.5 kilowatts. That's the biggest, most powerful heater that you can plug into a power point. So the waste heat generated charging your EV at 150 kilowatts is between 3 of those heaters and 6 of those heaters inside a metal box, being generated inside a metal box substantially smaller than a frickin' coffin, because that's what a battery box is. 6 of those heaters running flat out in an enclosed space. That's the waste heat. And heat is like a fluid in as much as you can pump it. You can pump it from A to B. And you do this with a circulating fluid and a heat exchanger. And obviously, this is a system that's designed into electric cars, mainly to deal with fast charging, but also to deal with fast discharging and things of that nature. So you plug in this way and you hear a fan activate and maybe a whirring sound as a pump works. That's the heat exchanger taking a shit ton of heat out of the box. And to me, this just underpins the scale of the thermal management problem because, 15 kilowatts, dude. If you had 15 kilowatts of heater running in Australia in winter, you'd have a nice toasty house. You really would. And that's the waste heat from charging your car. And it's not just activating for 5 minutes or something. It's going to be doing that continuously for 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the magnitude of the charging assignment. And it has to do that with 100% integrity, because if there is any kind of cascading failure, the temperature inside the box is going to ramp catastrophically and rapidly. So the countermeasure, the proposition is that complexity is the enemy of reliability. The only countermeasures in place are quality assurance up front and high levels of systematic safeguards in operation. And generally, I'd suggest that EVs manage all of that. They have good QA. They do, and they have high-level systematic safeguards. There's lots of sensors and active software control and active cooling and all kinds of shit that ordinary people don't think about going on in the background. And the only problem with this is, and this is a scientific engineering certainty as well, not all of the failure mechanisms can be known. A better way of putting that would be to say that not all of the event cascades can be known, leading to a catastrophic failure. They can't figure all of that out because it's too complex. A supercomputer can't figure all of that out because shit just happens. They don't have the fundamental data to predict the problems over time. That's just how this works. So, irrespective of how diligently all of this is implemented and how diligently all of the R&D takes place, there are going to be catastrophic failures of this nature of EVs. This is an absolute certainty. And that means what we need to do is we need to have a public education campaign about the nature of all of that. We need to say, is it a good idea, for example, to park EVs in underground car parks? And I would argue, no, it's not. Not because they're likely to burn catastrophically. They're not. It happens very rarely. But because the consequences are so severe and so potentially life and death catastrophic. We need to acknowledge this shit. Otherwise, every time you grab your kids out of the car, not necessarily an EV, but maybe an EV. Every time you grab the kids out of the car in an underground car park and you walk 150 to 200 metres across the forecourt to the shops or to the exit, whatever, then we really are in this position, all just rolling the dice on the in-the-moment integrity of all of those protections without acknowledging that shit can happen and stuff goes wrong. Like, there's a really interesting guy you can look up on YouTube or Wikipedia or something, James Reason. He's a professor of engineering, I think, although it might be mathematics, I'm not sure. He's the father of disaster analysis, and he says that the disaster works because you've got all of these things like the high voltage cut-off contactor, isolator switch that trips in a crash. It's a slice of Swiss cheese. He's got this thing called the Swiss cheese theory, and that is a slice of Swiss cheese. And like all Swiss cheese, it's got a hole in it because that isolation switch can fail, all right? And you've got all of those other things that I just mentioned, and they've all got their own slice with their own hole in it. And they all get juggled every time we use the EV, right? And not just EVs, but it's when you fly in a commercial jet or when you get in a lift and go 100 floors up into the Burj Khalifa or something. The Swiss cheeses are being shuffled continuously, right? And what you've got to avoid is that extremely rare moment in space-time when all of the holes line up, because when the holes line up, a disaster steams on through. And this is kind of the wacky world that all of those super diligent PhDs in engineering and hard science and coding and IT and electronic system design and component selection and quality assurance, there's dozens of these dudes and they all take it so seriously and they can't ever get it 100% right. And that is my ridiculously long-winded explanation for how this lithium-ion battery is different to the one in every EV. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I hope you sincerely got something out of it, hopefully a little bit of perspective on the way we're implementing this shit imperfectly throughout the developed world.